All right, good morning, everybody. Just great to be here. As you know, thanks to technology and to Bruce and the team. Um, while I'm in Vermont this morning, I get to be with you at the same time. So delighted about that. So thanks for that opportunity. It gives me a chance to spend a couple of days with the grandkids as they enter into this great spring time as well here in Vermont. So um, glad to be with you. The one thing I wanted to start off with was what a great celebration Easter was, and it was so wonderful to be together again with so many people, and just the spirit of the day was just lovely. And you know, kind of what I was exploring on that Easter Sunday is sort of what I want to continue to explore with you today a little bit, and that is, the character of the resurrection that we talked about. How do we think about the resurrection not as a historic event, but really the way in which it gives shape to our spiritual lives today? How does that happen? And in many ways, what I was encouraging you to think about in that Easter sermon was, how is resurrection a way, like an invitation to let go of one way of life that might be perpetuating dis-ease in world, and embracing another way of life that collaborates or participates with the kind of the spirit of the living God manifested in the life of Jesus, that allows for a collaboration and perpetuation of life itself, right? So that's sort of what I was exploring with you last Sunday. So I want to pick up on that as now in the weeks ahead we start to see these sort of appearance stories of Jesus. How does Jesus appear to people after Easter, after the crucifixion? What do these appearance stories tell us about the way in which we can today kind of get in relationship to a Jesus who's not a historic figure anymore, but who has become sort of um, the eternal manifestation of the living God in this sort of post-resurrection status? And how does that happen for the early followers of Jesus? How did they experience him after Easter? And can it give us some clues as to how we might experience this living Christ for ourselves? So that's what I want to explore a little bit today. And as I look at the stories, the many stories of the appearances after Easter that you might be exposed to in the next couple of weeks as we gather together, there's, I think, a couple of like indicators of how that might work. The first one is, and I think this is probably the most important one, is that in all the appearance stories, people don't go to some location in order to witness again the resurrected Jesus. Rather, Jesus is always showing up where they are, right? Jesus, post Easter, is appearing to people in their actual day to day lives. He's showing up where they're at, right? You see Jesus meeting somebody on the road while they're traveling, or on the shoreline while they're out fishing, or gathering together for a meal, or even when they lock themselves away in a room so they can hide. There he shows up. That the post Easter Jesus is always appearing where people are at in their everyday lives. They don't have to go looking for him. They don't have to go searching for him. Just there he is. And that's the beauty, I think, of these stories, for me anyway, is that, if you think about the trajectory of your life, that you're always moving, changing, growing, taking on different challenges and opportunities and crises, right? No matter where you journey, the presence of this living Christ is going to be showing up for you there, right? Right now, in every moment of your life. That's where God, the Spirit of God, the living, breathing energy of the sacred is going to show up. It's present with you. And there's just something so powerful about that and so reassuring about that, given the complexity of our lives and the ways in which our lives are always kind of unfolding, that I don't have to be anxious that I got to land in the right spot, or that I have to attend a certain celebration of the life of Jesus in order for that to happen. That's the beauty of this story, that the Spirit of Jesus is woven literally into the experiential lives of those who have been, um, journeying with him physically all those years in his physical ministry. Now he's present for them in the everyday world in which they find themselves. That's that's a great part of, I think, the appearance stories, is that spirit meets you where you're at, even if you're hiding, right? Like you can't even hide from that. You can close the doors, shut yourself off, and even that doesn't matter. That living spirit of Jesus continues to show up in those places. So that's number one, I think, is that real um, like sense that the Jesus after Easter is traveling with you in your everyday life, every step of the way, even when you might not be paying attention. That's number one. The second one is this sense that Jesus is kind of, whenever Jesus appears in the post Easter stories, he's sort of not, he's hard to recognize, right? People mistake him for somebody else. They're like, "Oh, really? Who are you again?" He has to tell people who they are, right? There's this real sense that um, that Jesus is not, the Jesus that is hanging around with the in the post Easter experience is more is not like physical, but more spiritual, more um, like dissolved into the experience of life itself. You don't quite know if you're really with this risen Jesus, right? In these stories. And I love the sense of that because, you know, it kind of means that maybe you'll meet Jesus in ways that you don't immediately recognize, that aren't super clear to you. So that as you journey into your life and you have these moments when you feel God is present for you, that can maybe happen at the seashore or in a conversation with a loved one or in a moment of quiet reflection or just in the busyness of every day, the interactions with a child or your own children or, whatever it happens to be. There's this sense that sort of a nebulous quality to the places and faces that invite you into the experience of the living Christ. And that's certainly the case in those early appearance stories, is that people are a little caught off guard that he's there with them. And even questioning, is that really you? Is, is that really you showing up for me? And the answer is yes. God, in a sense, has, or the spirit, or however you understand that, right, is showing up for humankind in a different way after Easter. And sometimes you might not immediately recognize where that is. So, how do you pay attention to your life, knowing that that can happen at any time, in any place, with each step you take along the way? That's an awesome invitation, I think, to the journey of spirituality in our time. So, that's the second one. That kind of dissolved sense of who Jesus is. That dissolved sense becomes even more powerful in kind of the third observation that I think you see, and that all of this is headed towards this what we call Pentecost. That day when this sense of the Spirit of the living Christ is not experienced by individuals. Those stories that you're reading now or experiencing now in this part of the season of the church year are all about appearances to individuals at some level. But then there is this complete like explosion in that this Spirit of the living Christ manifests on everyone who gathers at Pentecost, right? Everybody has that kind of sense that no matter who they are, God's Spirit is awash over them. And it's just a powerful story of where this is heading. It's almost as if, the Easter moment, starts off with this sort of singular event, you know, after the crucifixion. A few people are experiencing it, and then it just fans its way out into the life experience itself. And that we get caught up in what's going on. It's not as if we're creating what's happening. It's exploding and we're participating with it. That's the beauty of the Pentecost moment. And so that's the third kind of thing I think we pick up on these stories is this ever expansive nature of the way in which God is moving in world. So you just get to feel like it's a wave of enlightened awareness, right, or an explosion of grace, or however you want to name it, that you get caught up in, that you participate in, that you pick up the energy of it, right? That's how being spiritual is for today. You're open to that movement, whatever it might be, and as it expands wider and wider. So almost like a pebble that drops into a pond, right? That the pebble hits and then the waves fan out. We're caught up in that. That's the next piece of this puzzle, I think. The final one, and then I'm going to reference how Paul constructs this a little bit, is that ever since I started doing the Soul Forum podcasts when COVID hit, and I thought I just got to continue to look for how is spirit moving in the world when we can't kind of construct it in the way that we do typically on a Sunday morning. So I started getting into conversations with people. And what I will tell you is that in those conversations, what I realized, and you can listen to them on our podcast that we've got now, is that this spirit of, I would say, of the living Christ, and no matter what religious tradition you participate in, you probably will articulate it in the spirit of the Buddha or whatever it happens to be, right? I think whatever that spirit is that's moving in the world, that's connecting us to this great sense of who what we call God is in the world, it oozes its way into the nooks and crannies of every life, all of life. And if you pause to tend to it and just open up to hearing it a little bit, you begin to recognize it in ways you hadn't anticipated. Right? As I hear the stories of people trying to construct how they think about their own soul's journey or what's their deepest sense of their most authentic self, whatever the stories are, over and over and over again, I see, oh my gosh, while the language might change, the metaphors might shift, the nuancing of that story might be different than I would nuance it. You can feel this sort of way in which spirit is folding itself into every life and manifesting and kind of embodying itself in all these different ways. And I'm telling you, it just gives me all this hope that while we get dependent sometimes on religious constructs for holding the essence of how we relate to God, that's a helpful tool, and it's a predictable path that is something that can open us up to the spirit of the living God. But that's not the only place you can find it, right? It's everywhere, all the time, just happening, right? So how do you get in touch with that in your everyday life, with your neighbor, with your friends, with your career, wherever it happens to be, right? It's all there all the time. And there's just something like palpably beautiful about that. It is hard, I think, sometimes to recognize. It's hard to kind of nail it down, wrap your hands around it, but you get a felt sense for it as you open yourself up to the possibility that the Jesus you might have met who walked around Galilee and fishing villages and meeting with people in his time, that spirit of that Jesus is just fanned out across the entire experience of what it means to be human in our time, what it means to be alive in our time. And I think that's what these little stories are trying to help us to see, these individual stories of Jesus appearing for other people. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, I think really tries to capture it and kind of diversifies the way in which we think about this sort of resurrected body that we're a part of, right? So the resurrected body of Jesus is one thing, but the way in which these stories unfold implies that there's a different sense of what this resurrected body is really about, and that we're co-participants in the diverse manifestations of that new body. So here's how Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "What is sown, a physical body, is raised up into a spiritual body. For what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body which is to be, but just a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But then God gives it a body as God chooses, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not even all flesh is alike. There is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are celestial bodies, there are terrestrial bodies. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory for the stars. So it is with the resurrection. For what is sown as perishable is raised as imperishable." I think what Paul is trying to describe is sort of what we've been talking about in these appearance stories, right? That even the life of Jesus was a body in a time and place. But these stories remind us that after Easter, the Spirit of the living God is manifesting in a way that is imperishable, that never goes away, right? Is always present with you, is journeying with you every step of the way. That's gives me great hope and continues to encourage me to pursue a kind of spiritual life that's open to recognizing Jesus even in places where I might not have expected. And seeing this resurrected Spirit of the living Christ in your life and all of life, every day, in every moment. Let me close by sharing with you that some of the conversations that I had after Easter Sunday with people was folks enthusiastic that we had like 180 people show up for church on Sunday. And a number of people were telling me stories about how they've been reading news reports and noticing that so many churches are empty these days, not just in America, but around the world, right? It's just like there's nobody in those spaces anymore, and how unnerving that is. And in many ways, obviously I agree with them. It's a challenge for churches because we're not necessarily as robust as we once were, throughout the landscape of the human experience right now. So it's not just our church or the church across the street, right? It's everybody's having this challenge. At the same time, I would say that what we are seeing is almost like a diversification of the way in which people are engaged in that spiritual path. And that we as faithful folks who have seen this path unfold for us in a very structured way in organized religion, we should have the eyes and the ears and the heart to be aware of the way in which Spirit is stirring even outside of those kind of structural, predictable ways in which we've experienced God in the past. That we have to trust that this Easter story is the story of a constant explosion of the Spirit of the living God, and that we are called to see that happening everywhere, all the time, in everybody's life. And that's what should give us joy. So we don't get super anxious about whether the institution can carry the weight of this experience. That wasn't the case way back when, right? This is God's work in the world. And God's not done with us yet, right? That Spirit is always present for us all the time. When does the body of Jesus show up for us? Where does that body of Jesus show up for us? That's the question. And if you look at these stories, my guess is you need to keep your eyes open, your heart open, and your ears open, because it's all the time, everywhere, in every moment, and in every interaction you have in life. Are you ready for that? Is that the Spirit that's moving today in our time? I think so. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out today. Have a beautiful rest of the service. And I will see you next Sunday in person as I get back and we continue to explore these stories together. God's peace.